Well, I've got the old person's copy with large print. You have the smaller print. It's 14-point font, and that's usually good enough for most people to read. Matthew chapter 24. And the reason we're doing Matthew chapter 24, we are in Revelation chapter 8. And I'll just say it right up front. Matthew chapter 24 is the condensed version of the book of Revelation. Okay? It really is. And once you see it, you'll say, oh, I get it. Matthew chapter 24 actually starts in Matthew chapter 23. Unfortunately, we have the chapter divisions. There's I've told this, and Donato's used this a few times. I say it's the ABC method. It's what's above the passage, what's below the passage, and the C stands for the context of this. In Matthew chapter 23, Jesus delivers what he calls mine says 7 woes, I think I put 8 woes. So in Matthew chapter 23, then Jesus, beginning verse 1, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach but do not practice. And then he goes into this scathing rebuke of the scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you, blind guides, and woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. If I were there as a scribe and Pharisee, if you were there as a scribe and Pharisee, how would you feel? Not happy. That would be a grand understatement. Just the motivation they'd need to say, can't we get somebody to kill this man? Really, I mean, that's what it boils down to. And remember, he is talking to his disciples as well. They are listening to this entire speech that he gives in Matthew chapter 23. We come down to verse 37. And if you're on page 1, Matthew 23 sets the stage for what Jesus is about to prophesy against Jerusalem in Matthew chapter 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Listen to what he says in verse 37. Does everybody have a copy of today's lesson? It's 12 pages. And it is riveting. Riveting, I say. If anybody else needs. So, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. There are 2 times in Jesus' life that we have recorded that he cries. You know what those 2 are? First one is the death of Lazarus. And the other one is, oh, Jerusalem. He weeps over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Verse 37 of Matthew 23. The city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often I would gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. And you were not willing. I slowed that down. I don't know what the pace that he used there, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Ouch. You will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. What does that mean? Is he talking the resurrection? Or is he talking the fulfillment of the prophecy? Well, we'll get into that. Jesus left the temple. Now here's where we have, and I have the parallel right here on page 1. My copy looks the same as yours, only it's there. I have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are parallel. Every verse is parallel Mark, so that you can see, what did Matthew say? What did Mark say? What does Luke say? John does not cover this in his gospel. Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple. And his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. Luke says, then, as some spoke of the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and donations. Why would they say that? Yes. They thought, yes. And Josephus says in his writings, if you have not seen the temple in Jerusalem, you have not seen a beautiful building. It was absolutely gorgeous. By all accounts, anyone who ever said it, no one said, oh, that's really gaudy. Why couldn't they go with something Gothic? Why couldn't they go with something more Greek revival? No, they didn't. Everyone who saw it realized it was a beautiful building. His disciples hear him say this scathing rebuke, and for I tell you, you'll not see me again. He's condemning these people. His disciples point this out to him. Now, how many times do you think the disciples had been to the temple in Jerusalem? How many times do you think Jesus had been to the temple? Let's say Jesus was crucified at 33 years old, which is pretty reasonable. It says he was about 30 when he started this, so he'd be about 33. Remember what his mom and dad did every year? So he had been there, reasonable to think he'd been there 33 or 34 times. He might not have remembered when he was newborn 1, 2, 3, 4, but he'd been there. Okay? His disciples had been there. It's not like, oh, I just noticed this. Yes, he was in the temple. So it was nothing new to them. Let's see. Let's see. It tells us which ones when we get here. And there were 4. Peter, James, John, and Andrew, Mark tells us. Those 4 come to him. We assume that it's all the disciples, but Mark says there were only 4. If you read it, that's why I have this parallel when you go on to page 2. And Jesus said to them, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Not one stone. Have anyone ever read the accounts of how much some of those stones weighed? Tens of tons. Up to 100 tons some of these were. The only thing that is left today, if you've seen, in our Wednesday night class when we've seen the videos of Jerusalem, you see the people at the Wailing Wall, and you see the Hasidic Jews praying in front of that. That Wailing Wall is the foundation of the temple that was up on top of it. That's the only thing that's left. But everything above that, not one stone is left on top of another. And you hear that as one of the disciples, and you say, oh, okay. What is your reaction? Your reaction would be almost identical to what they see. Verse 3, pardon me. So his disciples, now he sat on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples came to him and privately, which is Peter, James, John, and Andrew, the 4. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, if you're, Wilma, you're a grammarian, how many questions are there? Is there one big question? Are there 2 questions, or are there 3 questions? Yeah, we don't have the advantage of seeing commas in there. But it's one big question, and there are arguments as to, are there 2 questions or are there 3 questions here? We like to say there's 3 questions. Mark records, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are fulfilled? So he only gives 2 things here. Luke says, teacher, but when will these things be, and what sign will there be when these things are about to take place? So it's the what are the signs, and when's it going to be? Those are the 2 overarching questions. Matthew records, and what will be the sign of your coming? Which, why would he say, what is the sign of your coming? Yes. It is an assumption that Matthew makes Here, remember, Matthew wasn't there. He's recording this of what the others have told him. You assume it's going to be the end of the world. It's going to be when he comes back. And remember, in Acts chapter 1, they say, is it at this time you're going to restore the kingdom of Israel? See, they still don't know it yet. They have not been given all the information. So they're asking the questions that you and I probably would ask. Well, what, are there going to be signs of this? And when's this going to happen? And Jesus answered to them. And we're still on page 2. And he begins by giving them a warning. Take heed that no one deceives you. Mark says, take heed that no one deceives you. Luke says, and you have this all right across here so that you can see very plainly. And I have them color-coded, by the way, too. So yellow matches yellow. All right? So that it's not going to be that hard to follow. Take heed that you are not deceived. So what's the first warning? Take heed. Don't be deceived. Do not be deceived. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. Many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will deceive many. Many will come in my name saying, I am he. Pretty consistent, isn't it? Now, historians record that many people came and said, I'm the Christ. I have this recorded up above. Up above this is the explanation for everything below it. We come down there. Gamaliel, in Acts chapter 5, verse 36 and 37, Gamaliel, remember Gamaliel was the one who Paul learned at his feet. And the disciples come before them, and Gamaliel says, wait a minute, be careful of these guys. You know, because if what they're doing is from God, you can't stop them. If it isn't, they're going to do it. So he identifies two men, Theudas and Judas of Galilee, who rose up and drew people after them and came to nothing. John warns of the Antichrist. Now, people today say that we're expecting the Antichrist, which they say is the guy on the white horse in Acts chapter 6. Get it right. Okay? John says clearly that there were antichrists in his day. And there were many antichrists. So when someone tells you today, we're waiting for the Antichrist to come, they don't know their Bible. They don't. They're ignorant of it. And ignorant is no reflection on, I'm not denigrating, but they really don't know what the Bible says. John says, and I have those verses, if you want to look them up. When John says, 1 John 2:18 and 22, 1 John chapter 4, verse 3, 2 John chapter 1, verse 7. 5 times in there, he says the Antichrists are already here. And what strictly, the shortest definition we have of the Antichrist is? The one who denies that Jesus came in the flesh. That's the shortest definition. Now the Antichrist today, when you read the Left Behind series of the late great planet Earth, he's the one that's going to rule the world. That certainly would be news to John and everyone in the first century. Okay? So they've reinvented the wheel somehow. Take heed, for many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ. And I was reading in either Adam Clark or John Gill or Albert Barnes, and they said that up to about the 1600s, 29 people identified themselves as being the Messiah. And there are people today, if you read it, there are people that over in Africa that say, I'm Jesus, I'm the Messiah. And he says, don't be deceived by all those people. Later on, he's going to say, and if someone says he's out in the desert, go. Or if he's in the inner room, don't do that. You'll know. Just as you see lightning flashes, lightning is in the east and flashes in the west, you see it. No secrets here. Come down to, by the way, if you want to interrupt me, go ahead. Any questions so far? It's pretty straightforward. It really is. Verse 6, we're on page 3. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, Mark says, do not be troubled. When you hear of wars and commotions, do not be terrified. Are there wars and rumors of wars today? Were there wars and rumors of wars when you were children 10, 15 years ago? Were there wars and rumors of wars in the 1800s? Has there ever been a time in history of the world that there have not been wars and rumors of wars? No. No, there haven't. But he is speaking specifically here in Matthew chapter 24. The overarching theme of Matthew chapter 24 is what? It's the destruction of the temple. That's what he's talking about. You're going to hear about a lot of things. Remember, they don't know this. They don't know what we know, but they're about to. Let's see, well, wrong page. For all these things must come to pass. For such things must happen. Luke says, for these things must come to pass. They're going to happen. But the end is not yet. But the end is not yet. And the end will not come immediately. Okay? When you hear about all these things, and if you want to read about, and Mona, you've read all of the Wars of the Jews by Josephus, so you've finished the whole thing. Real page-turner, isn't it? Josephus is a Jewish historian in the first century. He was captured by the Romans, and he became an interpreter, a go-between in Jerusalem. He was there. He saw the whole thing. But he recorded what we read of the Old Testament, which is called the Antiquities. But then when he comes to the War of the Jews, he's talking about these wars that are going on in the first century. And there are a lot of them going on. And remember, if you know your Roman history, you know that there was the year of no emperor. When Nero dies, they are thrown into civil war. There's going to be wars and rumors of war all over the Roman Empire is thrown into confusion here. But the end is not yet. These are just the beginning. And at one point, Jesus, not in this context, but he would talk in another one, he says, it's like the birth pains. Now, guys, we know about pain, but I'm going to tell you something about a little pain that women go through. It's called childbirth. Please don't throw things at me. I was just kidding. Really, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me. But, when a woman, the first contraction she had, that isn't the end, is it? It's just the beginning of birth pains, okay? That's really what it says. The end is not yet. This is just the beginning. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And they all say the same thing. There will be famines, pestilence, and earthquakes in various places. And if you know your Old Testament, what did God say the four things that he used? There's three that he uses all the time, but the fourth one is there. What are the things that God uses as a judgment against a nation or an empire? The sword, famine, and pestilence. War, famines which are caused by war, droughts, and pestilence. What's pestilence? Pestilence are more diseases. Yes, pestilence are diseases. And they're all intermingled. But those are the three. And the fourth one is wild beasts. And that's a tricky one. But here, you see them right there. And there will be famines, pestilence, earthquakes in various places. Nation rise against nation. You see it right there. There's the four, right there. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Mark adds, there will be famines and troubles there at the bottom of verse 8. He says, these are the beginning of sorrows. And I've highlighted those things in green so that you know there in verse 7 and verse 8. These things must take place. And Luke adds at the bottom in verse 11, he says, and there will be fearful sights and great signs from heaven. It's going to be a scary time. I add this just as one of the things that we watch today. Has our country gone through wars recently? Have we had famines in the United States? Have we had pestilence? Yes. This little thing called COVID? This little thing called the Spanish flu of 1917? Have we had problems with wild beasts? Thanks to Monsanto, they kill a lot of those. Am I saying that the Bible says the United States is going to fall? No. But I'm saying that God uses those four things to get countries to repent. And he may very well have used them with Great Britain. He may have used them with Germany. He may have used them with everybody if they'll listen to them. But these are the things that are there, and they are a judgment against that nation. It says that all of these things, and they're just the beginning of sorrows. It's just the beginning. The end is not yet. And I have here, halfway down on page 3, there's in capitals in red. I call them time stamps or time markers. And they are there that let us know that specifically something says, this will occur. So you watch for this. And so there's a time marker that's going to come here in the passage that comes in Matthew chapter verses 9 through 14. Then, we're on page 4, top of page 4. Then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. There's the first time marker right here. They will deliver you up to tribulation. And only Matthew says this. John will say in Revelation chapter 1, I am your brother in what? The tribulation. And I have Revelation chapter 7, verse 3. Where am I at? The time markers. The time marker when he says, but the gospel must first be preached. I'm not there yet. Hang on a minute. It says, then they'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And each of those say, for my name's sake. In Mark chapter 13 and verse 9, it says, for my name's sake. Luke chapter 21, verse 12. So you can see all of these are contained in there. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake, Matthew 24:10, and then many will be offended. They will betray one another and will hate one another. Then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Matthew's the only one that's the only color there, so you know that he's the only one that says this. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. The first time marker that we have is verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations. Then the end will come. The end of what? What's he talking about? Destruction of Jerusalem. Then the end will come. Was the gospel preached to all the world in the first century? Yes. How do we know? Bottom of page 3, Colossians 1:5. Because of the hope which laid up for you in heaven, of which you heard before in the word of the truth of the gospel, which has come to you, as it has also in all the world. Who said that? Paul. Was Paul inspired by the Holy Spirit to write that? Was Paul lying? It's true. The gospel was preached in all the world. That's your first time marker, right there. Colossians 1:23, if indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven. Why, and sort of a side note, why was it important for the gospel to go into all the world? And this has a bearing on why. Yes? Paul says every creature. Yeah. I'm going to assume, I'm going to take it at face value that it went to every creature, that it went to every corner of the world. That's all I can go by is what is said. I can say, Paul, you don't know what you're talking about. Paul, you didn't know how big the world was. Paul, you didn't know about. All I have is this. But Jesus said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. And we'll read about it in the book of Revelation when it did come. Okay, yes?
So then it was preached to everyone just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem.
He says it had to be preached to everyone. And Paul says it was in Colossians, and that's a prison epistle, so you know it was around 60 to 61 to 62. So it had been. Christ said this in, I think he was crucified in 30 AD, not 33. We can argue about that, but it was about 30 to 35 years before Paul records this. Glenn. 70 AD, when Titus went in, destroyed it. It's a fact. No one would deny that it was destroyed in 70 AD. Glenn.
I just have one comment, is the end has not come yet.
The end of Jerusalem came. The end of the Jewish system came, which is what he's talking about. Because the next time marker we're going to look at is verse 36. Because up to that point he says, all of these things must, there's a sign for all these things must happen. So whatever he's talking about here has to have happened. But what he means by the end, in the context of what he's talking about, is the end of Jerusalem. And that's the question they ask. When is this going to happen? Paul says all who are Israel are not Israel. True? And we've talked about this. All who are Israel are not Israel. Who is the true Israel today? The people that occupy Palestine or those who obey Jesus? You can't be God's chosen people over here and God's chosen people over there and obey two different. The writer of the book of Hebrews says, and what is old is passing away. Yep. The end of, he's talking, remember the context is the destruction of Jerusalem. In this, up until verse 36, he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So you have to follow along. Yep. You know, remember, it is the context of the destruction of Jerusalem. Yep. Yep. And that it becomes a point of contention because people truly believe, up to and including Jimmy Carter, who brokered this peace between Menachem Begin and the guy who wasn't Menachem Begin, and they shook hands, which was a big thing back in the 70s. It was a big thing. He believes, and many people believe, that's why we've got to save Israel. Save Israel because they're a sovereign state, not because they are the chosen people that are talked about in the Bible. And Mona?
I was just wondering, do you think the fall of Jerusalem was a metaphor for the end of, or for the merging of the Hebrews and the Gentiles? I think a metaphor for change.
Yes, it was what Jesus said. This is the end. And he said, your house is left to you desolate. And what does desolate mean? Empty. He's talking about the end, not only of Jerusalem, but the end. And the writer of why do you think the book of Hebrews was written? Because the end of Jerusalem is coming. The end of the priesthood, the end of sacrament, the end of everything is coming. And the writer of the book of Hebrews, whoever it was, Paul, Apollos, somebody else really smart, writes about this and tells about how much superior this new covenant is than the old one. Why would they need to know that? Because they say, and remember, this place is going to be destroyed. They're going to need to know that what is left is what God had intended from before the foundation of the world. Paul and then Diane.
What do you say to Paul's description of the Gentiles having been grafted in to the vine, I think, and Jesus says, I am the vine, and Paul going on to say, and don't get too uppity, you Gentiles who have been grafted in, because God is fully able to graft in the
And the context of what Paul says is, I want my Jewish friends to become Christians. I want them to be grafted back in. But when you realize that when they're talking about the end of this, that's why Paul is right. He spends from chapter 3 on through 13 talking about the advantage of being a Christian and trying to make them realize. But the Jewish way of system ended, and you can't say it any more forceful, it ended in 70 AD as it was planned. From the very beginning, it ended. And are there both Jews and Greeks today? What did Paul say? Neither Jew nor Greek. Neither male nor female. Don't go in that direction. Brad? Well, I'll come back to you.
Would you say that the grafting was accomplished through Rahab, which went into Jesus' genealogy, so that he was not a pure Hebrew?
No. No. The grafting came in when the Gentiles came in at Cornelius.
So you couldn't even make that argument?
No, you couldn't. In the genealogy, we're shown of all of these different tribes that came in, but the true grafting came in with the Gentiles, and Paul says this great mystery, when he talks in Ephesians, this great mystery, this revelation that I was given about this great mystery. What was the great mystery? That the Gentiles are now a part of God's kingdom.
That's in chapter 3, verse 5. In former generations, this mystery was not known to mankind, as it has now been revealed to the apostles, prophets by the Spirit, that the Gentiles have become fellow heirs, members of the same body, sharers in the promise in Christ, through Jesus and through God.
Yeah. And coming back to the grafting part, what is Paul trying to convince them there? He's not trying to convince them that there's two paths to eternity. He's trying to convince them there's only one. And it's a long study, and it's tough for us to believe because our whole culture is based around the fact that, finally in 1948, the Jews got their land back. When did God fulfill his promise that he made to Abraham? He fulfilled that everybody's going to be blessed in Christ, but he fulfilled that he gave them all of their land. Read Joshua chapter 21. That they became a great nation and they got their land. But there was a caveat. There was a warning that we talked about the Song of Moses. They're going to talk about the Song of Moses. The Song of Moses is not, look what happened to the chariot and the rider. The Song of Moses is the curse to Israel. In Deuteronomy chapter 32. And he says, in the latter days when you walk away, that's the Song of Moses that they're singing. And they would pay that price. We had one more hand up, two more, go ahead.
Both Jew and Greek or adopted?
The Jews were already in it. And that's why they became the first fruits on the Feast of First Fruits.
I know in our Thursday class, we discussed that. Wilma, do you remember what the scripture was? Regarding both Jew and Greek are adopted together in Christ. Through Christ.
Becoming, I don't know if I'd familiar enough with the word adopted in that, but there is the idea of that. Yeah. And Paul's argument through the book of Romans isn't two paths, and that the Jews were always going to be the chosen, is that I want you guys that are my Jewish friends to become Christians. That's my desire in all of this.
I guess that's what I'm saying is that the fact is that they were adopted in just like the Gentiles through their belief in Christ and baptism. They are also adopted. That we're all adopted now into Christ, both Jew and Greek.
Okay. All right, I'll chew on that for a while.
All of God's people are
And I'm going to come to,
In Israel and in the church,
okay,
both Jew and Greek are adopted.
okay. Brad?
The end of, the end of the, just a minute, I'll think of, the end of the sacrifice happened back in the first century. That there's no sacrifice any longer in
Yeah.
Judaism. It's not like it was.
Yeah.
And so it's fulfillment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think people have listened to the Jewish rabbis who have talked about this temple that they're going to build in the end, they're going to rebuild it, but they have no priesthood. And you read the book of Hebrews, who's the high priest now? And why do we want to go back to that system when it's been perfected in Christ? And so we've listened too much to people who said, oh, it's good, but the Jews got their land back in 1948. The Jews lost their land and their privilege and their rank once and for all in 70 AD. That was the end of it. And Jesus pronounces that curse, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills prophets. And he's going to say, in this generation, you're going to see it end. And no matter how much we try to want to say there's still God's chosen people, they're not. They simply are not. And what is old and fading away will soon perish. The law, and it was prophesied in the book of Ezekiel, in the book of Jeremiah, that said that this new covenant, I'm bringing a new covenant, and you can't have two covenants, can you? Cannot have two. Okay, boy, look at that. We made it up to 9 verses. Let's see. And then the end will come. Therefore, because of all this, here's the timestamp. Another timestamp. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads this, let him understand. He's still talking about the context of destruction of Jerusalem. That's why we know that it says, then the end will come. He's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem because he says, therefore. Therefore means what? Because of what I've just said. Still in the context when he says, and then the end will come. When you see the abomination of desolation. What is the abomination of desolation? It is the Roman army. When you see that abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Why? It's not going to be a place you're going to want to be. Still, it's all in the context of the destruction of Jerusalem, the end of Jerusalem, not the end of the world, the end of Jerusalem, which is what they asked. When are these things going to be and what's going to be the signs? When you see and Luke says it, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, then know that its desolation is near. That's why I put these all side by side so you can see exactly what each one of them said, not independent from each other, but alongside. When you see the Roman army surrounded it, read the book of Josephus. He talks about how they surrounded them and laid siege to it. But at a certain point, they're called away, and that's when the Christians escaped. The Jews tried to keep them from leaving, but the Christians escaped. Then let those who are in the mountain, and let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of the house, and let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those in the nursing babies in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter on the Sabbath. If this is the end of the world, why are they worrying about this stuff? If it's the end of the world, who cares if anybody's pregnant? Because you're going to heaven. They're not talking about the end of the world, they're talking about Jerusalem. When you see the army surrounded it, you better get out. That's the sign you're looking for. That's what he tells them right here. But woe to those. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Here's the sign. When you see these, get out. Is there any doubt of what the context of what he's talking about is the destruction of Jerusalem? It's really just as plain as it possibly can be. Now, we might get caught up in verse 12, or verse 14 of Matthew, and it says, and then the end will come. But you have to remember what's above it, what's below it, and what's the context. And that when he says, and then the end will come, you can't lift that out and say that must be talking about the end, and then go back and say, oh, now we're talking about Jerusalem again. You can't. Jesus wouldn't have done it, and neither can we. Any questions? We don't have anywhere to go. I told Janine, I said, I think we're going to make it all the way through. There's only 12 pages. But it is a difficult passage for some to understand, only because we are caught up into the Left Behind series and the late great planet Earth, when they're talking about all of these, especially when we get to the later in, and we're talking about the locusts, who look like they have brass, iron plates, and they have hair like women. We think, oh, it must be talking about attack helicopters. No. But it really is a fascinating. But once you see the time markers in here, and then once you get down to, and I'll give you a hint, go to verse 36. Up to verse 36, he's talking about Jerusalem. In verse 36, he turns a corner, but concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven nor the Son, but the Father only. Up to that point, he's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. And it really is easier than we try to make it, even easier than I try to make it. Any other questions? Okay, let's beat them to Applebee's. Oh, turn that microphone off.